Welcome. This lecture will be an introductory lecture in the vocabulary that we're going to be using in this class. So all of the terminology that we might find in theories of ethics, in particular, a number of distinctions that we'll be using across the class to discuss the works or theories of Aristotle, Mill, and Kant. When it comes to thinking about ethics and morality, we are often trying to make different moral judgments. But different kinds of moral judgments concern different kinds of terminology, different kinds of things. And these different kinds of things can be distinguished along the lines of the different kinds of questions that might be asked, morally speaking. So we can ask, say, whether or not a thing is good or bad, whether or not an action is right or wrong, whether or not a particular person has a right or an obligation towards someone, and whether or not a particular event or action was undertaken intentionally or it was merely accidental. Each of these things, each of these sort of distinctions or different ways of talking, different ways of questioning things, will be relevant along different lines when it comes to making distinct moral judgments. So, for instance, here, rightness and wrongness, or right and wrong, usually refer to actions, right? A right action is something that we ought to do, or at least something that is morally permitted to do. If an action is morally permissible, we say, then it is morally acceptable. It's not wrong to do it, right? Well, an action is wrong, it's if it's something that we should not do, if it's something that is impermissible, something that would be against morality. Whereas good and bad are a broader set of ideas, right? So a person can be called good, but so can an outcome or a character trait or a situation. Of course, rightness and wrongness and goodness and badness are related, but they're not exactly the same thing, right? Something can have a bad outcome even if the person maybe acted in a morally acceptable way, right? So you can end up with someone doing the right thing, but a bad thing ending up occurring because something went wrong outside of anyone's control. A right is something that a person is morally entitled to, such as protection or a freedom that they have, some kind of justified claim that they have to, say, their property. Whereas an obligation is something that a person is required to do or avoid doing, right? Often these two fit together, right? If I've the right to not being harmed by others, then others have the obligation to not harm me, right? But not every right works in exactly the same way, right? So some rights are mainly freedoms rather than claims that someone else must provide something, right? So sometimes I have the right to freedom of movement, which creates a certain kind of obligation that you have to not restrict my movement in some way, shape, or form. But also, like, maybe if I have the right to say happiness or something like that, that doesn't give you necessarily an obligation to promote my happiness. It just stops you. Maybe if anything, it gives you an obligation to not hinder my happiness that I'm seeking myself, insofar as it, doesn't harm you or affect you in any way. Another relevant moral distinction is, or just sort of a metaphysical distinction that's morally relevant, is one between actions and events. So ethics distinguishes between actions and events, and an action is something that an agent does, right? A person does. Agent versus person can get a little bit shady there, but usually an agent will say does something for some reason or purpose, has some sort of intention to act in a particular way. And an event is simply the thing that happens, right? Something that happens. There can be events like, like a game is played, or there can be events just like a year passed, stuff like that, right? So like an earthquake is an event, but it's not something that someone chooses to do. So it's not some kind of action, right? Unless God was to cause the earthquake, right? While choosing to help someone, say an old woman across the street is an action, right? This distinction is going to matter particularly because moral responsibility usually attaches directly to actions, in particular actions that are intentionally decided upon. Though some, of course, will also some actions that are not intentional will still come with moral responsibility. Still, people can, so sometimes people can be morally responsible for events, even if those actions were caused by their choices, though they or something that they failed to do, even if it wasn't something that they intended on. And this, of course, brings us to a very important distinction in moral jargon, that between intentional and accidental outcomes, I'd say, right? So actions that end up resulting in, they aim at a particular result, and if the action goes through, then you intentionally did the thing, and if somehow something occurred where the end results didn't actually happen, then you end up with some sort of accidental outcome. Right, so an intentional result is something that a person aims at or knowingly tries to bring about, whereas an accidental result is something that happens without necessarily being intended, right? You were trying to do one thing and something else happened. But there are also cases sort of in between, right? So like negligence or recklessness, where you may not have intended, say, harm or something like that, but you should have sort of known or foreseen the risks involved, the possibility of injury, the possibility of harm, right? And different ethical theories are going to give different amounts of importance to the levels of intention here, and whether or not those play a more or less serious role in the case of like whether or not someone counts as being blameworthy or praiseworthy for their particular action, etc. But for here, all you need to know now really is just these distinctions that are made and how they relate to actions and the notion of action. This brings us now to a sort of introduction to the three different thinkers that we're going to be discussing in this class, and how they use these kinds of terms and what they focus on. So for Aristotle, ethics is mainly about the character and the kind of person that we are or that we become. His focus in his theory is not just based on asking sort of what should I do, what kinds of moral rules I should follow, what kind of moral rules are there, but instead he focuses on what a good person would do, a virtuous person, a person that has all the right traits, that lives the right kind of life, someone that's courageous and honest and just and practical, right? So someone that's that's living a kind of flourishing life, a happy life, that's doing really well. What kinds of actions are they undertaking? Of course, intention is going to matter for Aristotle, and he distinguishes between voluntary and involuntary actions, and that ends up telling us, for him at least, the kinds of people that deserve praise and blame. But much of his moral thinking comes out of this focus on whether or not a person is living a good life and the kind of resultant actions that person uh, would be taking under those conditions. John Stuart Mill, on the other hand, takes a quite different approach. His view is one that we'll call utilitarian, which means that he judges actions based on their utility, namely the utility of the consequences of those actions, their usefulness, and whether or not they promote certain things, namely whether or not a certain action tends to promote the greatest overall happiness and reduce the amount of suffering, right? So the action he thinks that's the right one is going to be one that tends to produce the most happiness while reducing the most unhappiness. And this means basically that right and wrong are closely connected to the good and bad outcomes of actions. In For Mill, intentions are going to be something that tell us something about a particular person's character, and get us sort of onto whether or not we might think of the person as a good person or a bad person, but they don't actually determine themselves whether or not an action was right or wrong. On the Millian view, an action's rightness or wrongness is going to be determined on the basis of the consequences and the goodness or badness of the consequences. So good consequences creates a right action, bad consequences creates a wrong action, and then we can determine, how good and how bad, or how right or how wrong an action was, depending upon like the set of consequences that could have resulted. This is a vastly different approach to ethical theorizing from Aristotle, but it gets us closer to answering certain questions along the lines of like, what particular action should I take? Aristotle's view tends to be a little bit vague along those lines. Mill's view zeroes quite definitely down onto, well, you should do the thing clearly that promotes the most happiness and reduces the most unhappiness, or gets rid of the most suffering. Finally, Kant emphasizes much more a particular role for the notion of duty or obligation, and gives pride and place to particular moral principles or rules and intentions that we have. So for Kant, an action isn't morally right just because it happens to produce any kind of good result. The consequences for Kant actually don't matter for the rightness or wrongness of an action. What matters instead is whether or not the person that is acting acts according to a principle that's in line with the moral code. And the moral code he thinks of as the universal rule of law. Basically, he thinks that there are these abstract universal rules that everyone can have sort of access to and see as the rational rules of action that determine what you ought to do in particular situations. They're the kinds of rules that everyone ought to do in that kind of situation. Kant basically thinks that, like, okay, so you should always treat people in a particular way, always as what he calls ends in themselves and never merely as means. So he thinks basically like you should never treat people as tools to your own goals. You should always treat people as individuals that have their own goals in mind as well. And insofar as we do that, we have to recognize that these other people have rights. They have, we have obligations towards them, and we need to respect them and the value that they themselves have. Um, so, on the Kantian view, duties, rights, respect, and the motive behind particular actions are all very important to his theory. Kant, of course, Kant's theory here will be the most complicated one that we end up discussing. But hopefully by the end, you'll see some of the interest and kind of perspective of Kant, where he thinks that apart from being a good person or apart from understanding the rightness and wrongness of an action in terms of its good or bad consequences, he thinks the rightness and wrongness of an action actually come down to the reasonableness of an action and whether or not that action ought to be undertaken in any particular kind of situation that anyone can find themselves in. So all three philosophers can talk about actions and intentions, goodness, duties, and responsibility, but they organize all of these different ideas, sort of differently. Aristotle focuses on character and flourishing, whereas Mill focuses on the consequences of actions and the overall happiness of the individuals or of the groups, basically, that those actions affect. Whereas Kant focuses on duty and rational principles along with respect for persons. A useful shorthand, maybe, for you to sort of remember here is this sort of set of distinctions. Aristotle asks what the virtuous person should do in order to determine what the right thing is. Mill asks what option before you has the best consequences in order to determine the right action. And Kant asks which action can be justified as a moral rule that basically everyone could follow in order to determine the best kind of action. To help illustrate the difference here, you can imagine a case where someone asks you to lie in order to protect them. Say a friend. Say they ask you to lie about their immigration status to stop ICE from picking them up, or something along those lines. Um, Aristotle would ask whether the virtues of honesty, friendship, and practical wisdom, what exactly is required of those virtues in this particular situation. What would the person that is honest, is a good friend, and is practically wise, what would they do in this kind of situation? Would they lie to help? Mill would ask whether or not which particular action is the likeliest to produce the best consequences for everyone that's affected, right? So if you lie, can you end up going to jail yourself, or being detained? If you don't lie, does this affect the livelihood of your friends? Does it affect their happiness, or will it cause them to suffer? And Kant would ask whether or not the principle behind the lie could be made into a kind of rule where everyone would follow in such a way where it still respects everyone's dignity, where it still respects treating everyone as a particular agent with their own ends. Now, this is, of course, a complicated thing to say without fully fleshing it out, but we'll get there. We'll get there, of course. But this is a different kind of approach to an ethical theory, but hopefully it'll make sense eventually. But here, so you can see then that the same sort of situation can look different depending on which ethical theory you're attempting to apply. And we haven't even fleshed out whether or not any of them would say any particular action is the right one or the wrong one, right? So this will really depend upon the sort of case that's involved, the specifics of the case, and the specifics of the theories as we're going to be studying them from here on out. So first up is Aristotle, and we'll jump right into that quite soon.